Good morning. Well, I told everyone that I was going to be doing some historical stuff and discussing politics in the context of history. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about was economics. And I might do a little ranting, but everybody needs to let off a little steam because what's going on is a joke. One of the things that Trump said in his campaign was that he was for reinstating Glass-Steagall and for implementing tariffs on imported products that are from countries with really cheap labor pools. And those are two really great ideas, actually. It would fix a lot of problems in this country and get us back on the road to recovery. Because we are in the middle of a depression. The middle class is on its knees. Business is a mess. How we got here it's because people don't understand history. They let this stuff happen because they have no idea what's going on. They fall out of the sky into a situation and look around and go, wow, how did we get here? They don't have any context, so they don't understand it. And they think anything that Trump says has got to be bad, he's crazy. And a lot of the stuff that he says is crazy. Building a wall. We've got a wall already between us and Mexico. The problem is that certain people want the cheap labor coming in from Mexico. Okay, particularly conservatives. So they talk a good game, but when it comes down to it, they want this cheap labor to come in. They love keeping the labor rates down for their big multinational corporation donors. Democratic Party, the same thing. The Democratic Party has become a joke. The progressives need to take this thing over. People need to start going down to their Democratic Party clubs and different meetings and start raising hell. Because what the Democratic Party is doing is not a service for this country anymore. They are basically pushing everyone towards the Republicans. They gave us Trump. The Democratic Party gave us Trump because they stabbed Bernie Sanders in the back during the primary. They shoved Hillary Clinton down our throats when they knew she was a flawed candidate, when they knew that she was being investigated by two different FBI teams for the email stuff that was going on her server, her illegal server while she was Secretary of State, and the corruption going on at the Clinton Foundation with the pay-for-play stuff where an individual, particularly in the Middle East, when an individual would pay several $1 million donation, and it was understood that would buy them a meeting with Queen Hillary. Okay, everybody knew it, and the WikiLeaks things that came out when they released the emails, it is in their own words that they did it. So I want to give a little background on tariffs, okay, and Glass-Steagall. But first, we're going to talk about economics because in the 1700s, when the colonies were under the thumb of the British, we had, they talk about taxation without representation. Well, that was part of it. But the main problem was economics. We were being crushed by the British Empire, by the East India Company. And the way they did that was they would bring in goods from Asia, stuff that they had purchased over there very cheaply, and they would dump it on our shores, literally in our ports, forcing it down our throats that we had to buy their stuff. Well, for instance, we had cobblers making shoes and clothing and different kinds of things like that. Well, we were supposed to buy from the British, and so what that did was that undercut our manufacturers here in this country. It was much clearer back then how it worked. It's not so convoluted as it is today. It's very can be very confusing and can be very hard to understand what tariffs, the effects tariffs have on an economy. The colonies were having big problems with their manufacturing. They could not compete with the cheap goods that were coming in from England. There were certain groups of people that would buy from each other and their neighbors and things, but for the most part, they bought the cheap stuff coming in from England. So that's why our founding fathers understood what was going on with the British East India Company. They understood that free trade there was no such thing as free trade. Okay, it was exploitation. It was destruction of manufacturers. It was the crushing of the newly forming middle class, suppressing of labor rates. It was exactly the same thing that's going on now was going on back then, but it was much simpler form back then, so people could understand it better. And Hamilton, specifically Hamilton, he was very good. He understood how this worked. He understood about how slave labor, the evils of slave labor, but how it also undercut labor rates throughout the colonies. He understood about the need for a national bank, that the United States, when it was formed, needed to have its own currency and needed to loan money to itself. The British East India Company, that was what the British Empire was at the time. It was not a political empire. It was an economic empire run by the East India Company. And so what you had was you had a real difficult time here in this country with the colonies supporting themselves, making a living. It angered a lot of people. You had about 1/3 of the population was for the British, 1/3 was for independence, and the other third didn't care one way or another. And so we ended up with a revolution based on 30% of the population, because everybody knew the economics of it, but a lot of people were afraid to go against King George and the British East India Company. So what Hamilton understood was that you had to figure out a way to compete with the cheap labor pools, the products coming in. And the only way you could do that was create a level playing field. So for instance, if it cost $1 or a pound at that time to make a pair of shoes, and the East India Company would come in with shoes from Asia at 50 cents a pair, what happens? The colonial manufacturers cannot compete with that. Impossible to compete with it. So what Hamilton understood was that we needed to put a tax on imported goods coming in from the cheap labor pools. And so, for instance, if it was a pound to make the shoes here, cost 50 cents coming in, you would put a 50 cents tax on those imported shoes coming in. That created a level playing field. Then people could decide what kind of shoes they wanted to buy based on the styles of the day, or what the shoes were needed for working or dancing or whatever. So he set up a tariff system, and he tried to set up a national bank. And that's one of the reasons why he was assassinated by Aaron Burr, was because Aaron Burr was a British agent. He worked for the British. He wanted to split off part of the colonies and create his own country. They hated Hamilton because Hamilton was diametrically opposed to what the British East India Company were doing. He understood it very clearly. And he understood how to make it, how to fight them. The National Bank was set up to basically create currency, create credit to build our own infrastructure. One of the big things back then was roads and canals. And you couldn't borrow money from British banks to build a canal because they wanted too much profit. They wanted too much interest. It wouldn't have been profitable. It wouldn't have worked. But we needed the canals. We needed it for the general welfare of the population, so people could commute, get around, transport goods and services. And so Hamilton set up a system where we would create our own currency and loan it out at 2% interest, which was the cost of the administration cost of doing it, and for long-term investments. That way, that we could create these infrastructure projects, and in a way that would be financially feasible. We could get it done, and what would happen was that would raise up the standard of living of the entire population. So British East India Company hated him. They hated Washington. They hated Benjamin Franklin. They knew what was going to happen. They knew that this uprising was going to be really difficult to put down. But it's very interesting because when a lot of this discontent was going on, a lot of it was starting in Boston. And one of the first things that the British did, they were worried about the militias. That's where the Second Amendment came from. That was the beginning of the American Revolution, was when the British tried to take all of our weapons from the farmers and the people around the Boston area. They sent out troops to go and confiscate weapons. Well, the colonists heard about it, spread the word, hid the weapons, formed their militias, and got ready. Not exactly sure who fired the first shot. There's speculation on both sides. We think that our side, American side, did, but there was some disputes about that historically. So the British were ripped to shreds. Because we fought a different kind of war. We fought based on the kind of Indian fighting that we learned and understood, fighting against the French and Indians. Was that they hid behind trees, they wore clothing, they blended in with the environment. This European gentleman's war tactic of standing in the middle of a field with a bright red and white uniform on. Try to imagine that today. It's ridiculous. But the British considered us barbarians because we didn't fight wars in a gentleman's way. So too bad. Okay, that's the way it works. If you want to win a war, you have to be tactical and you have to beat the enemy at his own game. So a lot of these soldiers were just slaughtered. They were just taken down because they were just standing in rows, in line, saying, "Shoot me! Here I am. I'm a target." So we took losses on our side also, but that was the beginning because that was when the colonies realized that we had to get rid of the British. We had to get rid of this blight, this crushing economic force that was trying to keep us subservient and in basic slavery, which it became. And this whole royal family notion, that was why we created presidency in the different House of Congress and Senate. It's because the smell of royalty and entitlement was disgusting. That you were who you were based on what family you were born in and what money that family had, instead of the work from your own brow, sweat of your own brow, and working to achieve something. So tariffs did the trick. In fact, the United States income came from tariffs and from selling of land. We didn't have income tax, until 1913, the same year that that the Federal Reserve was formed as well. So I don't know what was going on. I need to study more about the Congress 1913 to find out how these people caved in to the interests of the banks, because that was what it was. They wanted to, the income tax was put in to pay for us going to war in World War One, and it was supposed to be just temporary, of course. But once you have the tax in, it's really hard to get rid of it. And so the Federal Reserve was also a way of taking down the national banking system and making it mandatory that the United States government would borrow money from private banks, particularly London banks. And that's how these people had a stranglehold on the economy. Rothschild even said, he said, I don't care who wins an election. All I care about is who controls the money, because if I control the money, I control the country. The multinational corporations, these huge corporations with oil companies and rail, they understood that very clearly. And that's why they forced the income tax, and they forced the Federal Reserve down Congress's throat. And so we end up with the system we have today. We borrow money from private banks. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It is not part of the government. We are servants to private banks. That's why we're in so much debt. It's because we're borrowing money from private banks to run our economy. It's ridiculous. We should be making our own currency, borrowing money from ourselves at zero interest. We don't need to borrow money. We create the credit out of nothing, just like these private banks do it, except we don't have to pay the debt back if we create it from ourselves. The way the banking system works now is they take money. If they get a $100 deposit, they can create $1,000 worth of money to loan, and then when they loan that, then they can use those assets to create another $10,000. So the banks create money out of nothing too, but we end up having to pay huge amounts of debt back, interest payments and debt back to these banks. They make a huge profit on war. That's why we are in endless war. They came up with a way to do it. Let's fight terrorism, and let's call it patriotism. Let's support the troops. How gullible can we be? Okay, that's why we need to know history, because if we knew it, we wouldn't allow this crap to go on. So I'm going to close with that right now. We can discuss this further later on, but I'll let you go. And click like if you want, subscribe if you want, make a comment. I'll try to respond. Have a great day. Thank you.